Greetings, friends. Today I want to explore what it means to be grounded and thriving in our lives. Some years ago, on one of my silent retreats, I worked with the parable that Jesus told in Luke chapter 6 of the house built on rock with solid foundations, compared with the house built in sand that quite quickly collapsed. And this image called out to me strongly on this retreat to not pay so much attention to the outer structures of my life or to the voices that pull me here and there, but to allow my foundations to be deeply laid at a level that's not visible from the outside. It's not glamorous or obvious work, but it is necessary. And the image that stayed with me from this retreat is how easily we can be seduced by a false image of thriving, paying attention to what is visible out there and perceived to be worthy, relevant, and of value. But this is like building an impressive house with all the latest decor and fixtures, but which does not have secure foundations. And the calling that kept coming to me on this retreat and since has been, come deeper, come deeper. And some of my journal notes from that retreat, I'll read them. It strikes me how little I've noticed the many voices that I've allowed to control me from out there, how much I have allowed myself to be plucked around by expectations or by my outer projections. I have allowed myself to become imprisoned by these. The key is to attend more and more to the hidden foundations, to go deeper into the freedom of God. Now, another image I want to bring in here because it links so beautifully with this is the image of a tree. And we tend to look at the beautiful flowers, the sweet fruit, or the lush spread of greenery as a symbol of a thriving tree. But this thriving is only possible when a tree is well established. It has a good root system that reaches deep into the ground. Without this, the outer structure would soon wither or fall over at the first sign of challenging weather conditions. And so I want to look a bit further into this image of a tree being rooted in the ground. The outer leaves and branches of the tree are easily swayed and even broken in heavy weather. And for many of us, it's easy to feel tossed about by circumstances, especially in the times we're living in, where nothing is predictable and the future feels very unstable. But even just in the usual turbulence of daily life, when circumstances don't go according to how we thought they would, or when we get triggered in some way, our conditioning can take over and we get carried off by familiar and often unhelpful patterns of reaction. And somewhere inside, we know that these conditioned patterns are unhelpful and mostly beyond our conscious control. And so we quickly turn on ourselves with blame and self-shaming, and everything becomes really murky. And all of this feeds back into our anxiety and then our determination to control our circumstances so that we don't get triggered or feel shame in the same way in future. This becomes a very unhelpful, self-reinforcing feedback loop. And this can leave us trapped in tight prisons and stuck in self-reinforcing patterns, very far from the freedom and the thriving that we yearn for. And eventually, if we don't find a deeper inner anchor, we hit a time of crisis and inner turmoil, and we don't know what to do with this. We haven't always been taught to navigate this kind of crisis time in our lives. Many of us, in our attempt to find security and grounding, cling to our beliefs or theories about God and life, mistakenly thinking that this will bring us security. But this leads to all sorts of false identity and stubborn positionality, my beliefs versus yours, who's right, who's wrong, who's more right, and looking at the world around us and the history of religious wars and persecutions, it's clear that this is not really laying deep roots as much as digging in our heels in our attempts to find some kind of certainty. And all this really does is fuel divisions and destructive othering and keeps us from open heartedness, freedom, and love. Sometimes you can literally feel the sense of withering in places of that kind of ideological or religious certainty and the judgmentalism that often goes with that. Another strategy we employ is to try to get a handle on our thoughts and emotions, learning to think more positive thoughts and live healthier lifestyles. And this does help to some extent. But that work is still not foundational enough, and sooner or later, we see the extent of the tangled knot of our conditioning and how this is keeping us from truly thriving. And the invitation is expressed so succinctly by Thich Nhat Hanh, who said, "The only way out is in. The only way out is in." In Albert Nolan's book Jesus Today, he describes the gospel as calling us to a radical liberation. And he wrote, radical means reaching down to the roots. The freedom that Jesus experienced reached down to the very roots of his being. It was the freedom he challenged his followers to strive for, and it is the freedom that challenges us today as we hover on the edge of chaos. And so the invitation is to be drawn down into the roots of our being, where our being is grounded and sourced in God's being. And in this way, becoming rooted and anchored in God, the ground of our being. Meister Eckhart describes the ground of the soul as the very essence of the soul, which is the soul's most secret part. In that ground is a central stillness. For this part is by nature receptive to nothing save only the divine essence, without mediation. Here God enters the soul with God's all, not merely with a part. God enters here, the ground of the soul. Here God enters the soul with God's all. What a statement, sure. So how do we do this inner work? How do we become rooted in this ground? And a very important part of the journey is to begin to recognize what we're doing on this outer structure, to recognize the mental habits and conditioned urges that take over when we are triggered, when we do feel like we need to take control, and that take us away from being present and grounded in our lives. Deepening into the ground involves a choice to return to presence, to stay with whatever is here, even anxiety, distress, or other difficult pattern in us that we're starting to notice. Noticing our usual urges to escape or control the moment, and choose instead to remain grounded in presence, in the moment as it is. That's such an important starting point. And then from this place of aware presence, find that part in you that remains stable and unmoving. while tender and non-judgmental. That part is actually always here, just so easily overlooked. The part in you that Meister Eckhart described as the ground, that is the very essence of your soul, that central stillness in you. Here, James Finlay describes that our ground and God's ground are one ground. And it is here that we are tapping into God as our deepest source of being, the place where God enters the soul with God's all. And so in this process of bringing awareness to our reactive patterns and conditioned tendencies, which are like the branches of the tree being blown about, that level at which our attention and sense of self is so often caught up, as we bring awareness to all of this, we can begin to discover the part of us that is quiet and able to be aware. This is the part of our being that is nearer to the ground, so to speak, the stable, central stillness within us. And as we feel into this awareness, we discover its quiet, non-judgmental presence and gentle stability that's always here. A key point in this inner work is that we cannot change our thought or emotional patterns. That conditioning just goes too deep for our minds to be able to meddle with. And we cannot will ourselves into this stable central stillness. All we can really do is let go and surrender into presence, into stillness, and entrust ourselves to God, who enters the ground of our soul with God's all. And so this is the practice, over and over, to rehabituate us from where we get caught, to let go of that outer level where we've invested so much of our identity, but which is caught up in so much turbulence and suffering. And to surrender, allowing our center of gravity to shift from those unstable outer branches to the stable, sturdy rootedness. Moving from the sense of threat out there to the quiet, grounded center here, now, where we are anchored in God, our roots reaching deep into the ground and source of our being. Cynthia Bourgeault describes the work of centering prayer or meditation in this way: every time you are willing to release a thought, to perform the gesture of self-emptying, this gesture is patterned and strengthened within you. In time, with patience and persistence, it begins to take shape as a magnetic center within you, a deeper pull or gravitation that is clearly perceptible, like a tug to center. Your emerging magnetic center is increasingly recognized as the actual inner pulsation of a mutual yearning, yours for God and God's for you. This living ground of our being is yearning for us and through us, calling to us with increased urgency to become rooted and established in the love that nourishes us and frees us from the tangles of our fear and drivenness, allowing us to truly flourish and thrive, bearing fruit that will last, and whose leaves are for the healing of the nations. May it be so. May we become deeply rooted and established in our loving God, the ground of our being.